scale.
Just to go to one company, and I'll just give you an example. If you're doing face-to-face interviews with, in a specific area, take pharmaceuticals, because that's money. If I wanted to do face-to-face interviews with another company, then it's highly likely they're not going to tell me anything. Because I work for a competing company. Therefore, is it acceptable just to use my own company, or would that sample size be considered too narrow?
It's acceptable as long as you can use your company to address an interesting question. So I think the starting point has to be, have you got that question to start with? And would that in-depth case study of your organisation help you answer that question? And if that works, that's fine. But if at the end of the day, it doesn't get you very far, then inevitably the answer would be no. So again, we all come from different backgrounds, and my background is more, let's make a comparison. So I'd be trying to look at a few other organisations, but no, it doesn't have to be done that way, as long as you can address that question.
A related question. If nobody agrees to be interviewed, can you rely upon published information such as regulatory filings or public accounts to do qualitative research?
A simple answer is yes. All right, but sometimes it's, oh, sorry, what was the question? Right, okay, I'll try and summarise the question. Right, so what you might be thinking of doing is doing some qualitative research, all right? What you might be thinking of doing is conducting some interviews. But it turns out that, these people don't want to be interviewed. Now, as long as you can achieve your objectives, so it goes back to the research question, then it's certainly possible to use secondary material. So material that's already been published. That's not a problem at all. But in some sense, you need to be adding value. And this is, I think, that can be the danger for some people. So if you just end up telling us what is in this particular regulatory document, and this one, then that isn't really adding any value. If you're using that material for a particular purpose, so that goes back to my idea of an overriding research question, then you are adding value. So there's nothing wrong with using secondary material, as long as it allows you to address that research question, which I started out saying, in some sense needs to be interesting or slightly different. And you can find that in all the different areas of management, really. So, sometimes a marketing topic might be relying on secondary data from Intel or something of that nature. As long as that information is there and can be used to achieve your objectives, that's not a problem. A finance type project might be relying on data from FAME, so numerical type data. Again, it's secondary, and no reason why you can't use that as long as it achieves your objectives. Even in the kind of HR, OB area. Again, there are various surveys that have been conducted, and if you want to make use of that material, no problem at all. So you don't have to, which I suppose is implied a little bit from this, you don't have to go out and conduct interviews. You don't have to send a questionnaire or something of that nature. But what you do need to do in some sense is add value. So do something a bit different. Use the existing material in a slightly different way. Maybe again, going back to what I was saying earlier, you find some research that's been done for the UK, which has made use of this particular source. You find there's a similar source for your country. Again, someone has already collected this information, use it for your country. And again, you can then make that comparison. Sorry, I have to be a bit louder again.
Can you provide some guidance on how you determine what sample size to use if you're doing a qualitative analysis or you determine the sample size?
Not really. I can't do that whether you're talking about a quantitative project or a qualitative. What I guess you'd want to do if you're talking about a qualitative approach is not simply conduct one interview. All right, the more interviews, the better, particularly if it's within one organisation, because you're then getting different perspectives. And the extent to which those prospectus align would suggest more about the organisation than if everybody saw it differently. So you are talking about, off the top of my head, but not really a rule, 3 interviews, 6 interviews, 7 interviews, I don't know, something of that nature. But again, how many depends on how much depth you're going into with each interviewee. Right, okay. Again, it depends on the approach you're adopting, and it also depends on what you're actually trying to say. So, in general, if you take a qualitative approach, that probably wasn't a good word. If you take a qualitative approach, then you can't really generalize. So, if you've interviewed half a dozen people, then you can't really say, right, this applies to the whole industry. Okay? But if you take a quantitative approach, then there are some arguments that say you can. But, just trying to think the best way to put this. But you can still never be certain. So you can allude to that effect. You can say, this suggests that it applies to the industry. And if you want to be really technical, you can say something like, we were 95% sure. But you're still never certain. So whichever approach you take, don't be dogmatic in saying this is definitely the case. Because whenever you're conducting any sort of research, you can never be 100% sure. You've got a much bigger margin for error, and you cannot quantify it when you conduct qualitative research. But you've also got a margin for error when you conduct quantitative research. The only difference is there are arguments to say you can quantify that error. But it doesn't mean you're absolutely right. You could still be wrong. Right, so run out of time here. But a few things to contrast. The qualitative approach, so a small number but in depth. The alternative is some sort of quantitative approach. In terms of what we've got here, or in terms of most of what we've got here, could apply to information that someone else has collected and you're actually making use of, but I guess would also apply if you were thinking about putting together some sort of questionnaire, hopefully building on the existing literature, and then doing some sort of statistical analysis related to that information that you've collected through the questionnaire. And again, someone was asking in the context of interviews. In the context of questionnaires, there's not a number you need to get. The more the better, but that's a fairly flippant kind of thing to say. One of the things to bear in mind is the nature of the analysis. So what you want to do with the information that comes back partly determines that sample size. So, how many questionnaires I need to get back. So if you want to do something that's at all sophisticated, then you probably need 30 or more. You might be well constrained by the 30. So you might need 50, 60. But again, looking at the literature should help you a long way in that direction. So how did other people analyse their questionnaire, which is similar to mine? What did they do? What were they trying to get out of it? If it's a simple comparison of 2 categories, then probably a relatively small sample size works. If it's using some more sophisticated technique, then the sample size will need to be bigger. And again, in terms of this approach, in terms of your original research, there are dangers in the same way as there are with the qualitative approach. Qualitative approach, people suddenly say, sorry, I'm not going to do the interview. Quantitative approach, you send out some questionnaires and they don't come back. So again, as I said already, this can be time consuming. Because if you need a certain sample size, you're going to have to send out some more questionnaires. And maybe some more. So inevitably, that kind of research stage is quite time consuming. And the earlier you get to that stage, in that sense, the better, given it may take a while to get that information back, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. The other thing, let's see where we're going after this. All right, I'll leave that. You've got it in front of you, yeah? Right. So, where should we go? Okay, all right. So in terms of the slides, that's where I want to go. But say some more things about that notion of time consuming. So, thinking of your initial project may take a bit of time. Doing a literature search, honing it in, discussions with the tutor so everybody thinks it's doable and it's a good idea will take a bit of time. But after that, what you can be doing is writing some of the material as you go along. So you don't have to just go through all the stages, get to the end, and then say, right, I'm going to write it up now. That's going to be a very daunting task, right? 15,000 words. So no reason why, once you've got your initial ideas, maybe even before you've put in the proposal, no reason why you can't start drafting a bit of material. A bit in terms of your introduction, a bit in terms of the literature, because you already have some of that in your proposal anyway. So cut and paste it into chapter of your dissertation, make it a bit more substantive, do a bit more of a search of the literature, identify some more articles, make some notes on those articles. So the more you can put together as you go along, the better. So it doesn't become this daunting task at the end. I've done my reading, I've got all these notes over here, I've got my questionnaires back, and I've done the analysis here. All I've got to do now is write it up. All right? Now, I don't think in the context of dissertations, I'm not aware of it, but I know that various PhD students have got in that situation after about 3 or 4 years and just not submitted at the end, because that notion of doing it all at the end becomes so daunting. So it really is good practice to do this as you go along. And you can then modify, you can improve. So get a draft together, have a read through, improve it while you're waiting for those questionnaires to come back, or those people to agree to the interviews. All right, so moving on a bit, partly because of time and partly because I think I said most of those things before we got to the slides. A little bit about what we're looking for in terms of the overall dissertation. All right. A little bit is in terms of the kind of format and so on, but that's not really that important. That makes it easier to read. The most important bit is you've thought through those various stages, the process, and that everything links together. So you've got some research questions that actually make sense, and in some sense, can we regard it as academic? That you've looked at the literature, and in some sense, your project builds upon that literature. And again, we've talked about various different ways in which that might be the case. Also, your methodology, in a sense, links to that literature. So don't do what I was saying earlier, well, that bit's done, I'll now go on and do something completely different. Everything has to link together. And also, that your analysis, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, tells us something about your research questions. So it isn't just a description of this interviewee said this one, this, and this one, this. What you're trying to do is to draw out the themes, and the themes that relate to where you were starting in terms of this is why I want to do the project in the first place. Similarly, if it's quantitative, it's not just, 5% said this, and 50% said this, and 3% said this. How does that relate to your research questions to start with? So you've been linking it all together. And again, it's a bit of a flippant phrase, but it is the way I think about it, creating a coherent whole. So all the way through, we see where you're going, we see how what's coming subsequently linked with what went before. So I've probably covered this also,